Everybody all set? Please get up and get something to drink if you need it.
Yeah, and if you do want to refill, just quietly wave to me.
Wave to Michael and he'll fetch it.
I'm ready for you though.
Oh, okay. Well, I decided this month when I was looking through press releases on the internet and just kind of playing around deciding what I was going to do, I found out this is International Underground Railroad Month, which I didn't even know existed. But September is. And the reason it is called International Underground Railroad Month is because September is the month where each Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were released out of slavery. So September is the month for freedom from slavery because of Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. And so I thought, well, that's a different angle. That's when both of them were freed. And I started thinking about what I knew about Orleans County. And Orleans County hosted Frederick Douglass 2 different years, 1849 and 1855. And he was here for several days at a time, traveling around to different towns and speaking to people about slavery and abolition. And so I thought, well, how great it is for us to have had him here. And the Underground Railroad was part of Orleans County too. And in recent years, we've marked a couple places as ports on the Underground Railroad. The school here in Albion Academy on between West and East Academy Street, where it's middle school now, but
it's the nutrition program.
Yeah, and before that there was a brick schoolhouse there, and that housed a man who was principal at that school, and he was also a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And slaves would come into town undetected. They would go to Joel Whiting at the schoolhouse, and he would take them upstairs because his daughter, Sarah Whiting, recalled in her memoirs about her father taking food up the back stairs to the attic. And she questioned him and said, "Dad, what are you doing with food going to the attic?" And she followed him up the stairs, and she says he opened the door, and behind the door were a number of black faces waiting for their food. So Joel Whiting was a conductor on the Underground Railroad right here in Albion, right on between West and East Academy Streets, which I thought was phenomenal. I was just amazed at it. So it got me thinking, where else in Orleans County might they have been? Well, there was actually a house in Holley, and there was one in Medina. So most Underground Railroad routes go the Ridge, because the first one I heard about was Robert Anderson, who was a Gaines person, and they listed his house as a place on the Underground Railroad. So my assumption, and you know what that does, was that they all came in through the Ridge Road. Well, that's not so, because they came through Holley, Albion, and Medina. So what we know as 31 must have been a route on the Underground Railroad. And so there were more than 1 or 2 places in Orleans County that housed runaway slaves on their way to Canada, which just amazes me that there was that much pull, and it's very hard to find out about these people because they were keeping it quiet. They didn't want anybody to know. They didn't want an invasion to catch slaves. So finding information on them is a challenge and a half because they didn't want information found on them. And it's only years later when an ancestor says, "Oh, my uncle helped with the Underground Railroad. I've heard all these stories." But then you go from the stories to how do I prove it? You know, because I've heard stories from my grandparents that I don't know whether it's true or not. Sounds good, but I don't know if I can prove it. So Underground Railroad is a very difficult place to project to verify stops on the Underground Railroad. The trail to Niagara County, which would be the step towards getting to Canada, to getting out of the United States, led through Orleans and Niagara counties. According to a story handed down in the family, Robert Anderson hid runaway slaves in the cobblestone house 1 mile west of Gaines in Orleans County. So that cobblestone house does have a marker in it about Robert Anderson owning the house. So there was one that people have talked about for years that was on the Ridge Road. He was one of the first abolitionists and was involved with the Congregational Church in Gaines. And the Congregational Church in Gaines split and had the regular Congregationalist Church and the first Free Congregationalist Church. The first Free Congregationalist Church was partially based on freeing the slaves. So whether you were an abolitionist that was pro-freeing the slaves or not, you must have had some conflict in church, because Robert Anderson helped the church to split, and there was the first Free Congregationalist Church. And Gaines was not the only place that did that. There were other First Free Methodist. That was a connection with abolition, but also freedom from having to pay for your place in church. They used to have fees for which seat you had in church. So free also meant free from any charge going to church, but it also meant freedom from slavery. So first free any church probably can trace their beginnings back to abolition and slavery. Excuse me. There also clings a story to a house in Barre. When you go into Barre, across from what used to be the little store, there's a brick house that's abandoned right now. But there's stories about that brick house being a stop on the Underground Railroad also.
Wasn't that a tavern?
It was a tavern. Yeah. But they believe that they found steps leading to the attic and to a hidden room. Now, it hasn't been proven, because in a tavern, the back stairs leading up to a little room in the attic could have been a place to dry herbs. Because people who grew their own food, created their own liquor, had spices that they put in their liquor while it cured, might have a place in the attic to hang herbs. So don't jump to the conclusion that that was a place to hide slaves, because it might not have been. It might have had a very everyday usage. That's where all the proof, there has to be a lot of digging, a lot of documentation, who owned the place, when they owned it, were they an abolitionist? You know, you have to kind of piece it together and pray to God you find something that says absolutely this was a place on the Underground Railroad. And the more I dig, the more I find, like this place in Barre. I've heard other people say, well, it was on the Underground Railroad. And I think verbally we've heard it for years in Orleans County, that that house was a place on the Underground Railroad. Can I prove it? No. I've got a good guess. I mean, you can connect people who have lived there maybe with what they were promoting. But until you have proof somewhere in an old document, now that's with the house in Holley. And also the schoolhouse here in Albion. The Orleans County newspaper interviewed the daughter of the man who was principal at the schoolhouse in Albion, Sarah Whiting. And she's the girl that said she remembers her father taking food up the stairs. That is the closest you have to proof. Okay? Somebody who was related to the person who worked there or owned the property, that's the closest we can prove. I'm not saying it didn't happen, it did. I'm just trying to nail down the specific places that were on the Underground Railroad here in Orleans County. Also, Frederick Douglass was a man who visited here in Orleans County innumerable times in 1850s and the late 1840s, like 1849, and then was back again in 1855. He went around Orleans County in many places and gave speeches on anti-slavery. And there was a Mr. Pratt in Ridgeway, Lemuel Pratt, who did a lot of pushing for anti-slavery, a lot of pushing to have Frederick Douglass come here to give talks. And they gave talks in Holley, Kendall, Two Bridges in Carlton, Yates Center, County Line, Somerset, Charlottesville, Wilson, Ransomville, Lewiston, Lockport, Royalton Center, Shelby Center. These are all places where the abolitionists spoke. So you can see they were all over. They hit every small town that was listed. Many urgent calls from Orleans and Niagara County have been sent to Frederick Douglass's office for an anti-slavery lecture. An able and efficient man is now to be sent out to those counties, one who draws large audiences wherever he lectures, the friends of the cause for which he labors who reside there, especially called to exert themselves and to see that nothing be wanting on their part towards rendering the meeting successfully in every respect. So they were pushing to have Frederick Douglass come here, and everyone should respect him for what he was pushing for, that he was the man to have come here and speak on abolition. Frederick Douglass and William J. Watkins, who was a local man, contemplate holding a series of anti-slavery meetings in the above-named counties, which I just did. On August 10th, the following places have been already named by Mr. Lemuel Pratt of North Ridgeway. The friends in each of these places are called upon to make immediate arrangements for the meetings, and they are at liberty to fix the hour for their lectures. We hope nothing will be wanting on their part towards rendering them successful in every respect. Holley, August 10th. Kendall, the 16th. West Kendall, the 17th. Two Bridges on the 18th. Yates Center on the 19th. County Line Corners on the 21st. Somerset, the 22nd. West Somerset, the 23rd. Charlottesville, the 24th. And it goes all the way through to Shelby Center on the 3rd of the next month. So they really scheduled these meetings, and you couldn't give the excuse that there wasn't one next to you. You couldn't say you couldn't get there, because there were meetings all over this county, from west to east, north to south. And for further information, the friends in these places can confer by letter to Mr. Lemix at Ridgeway, Orleans County. So if you aren't clear yet, you can write to Mr. Lemix and he'll clear things up for you. The place in Holley has recently got a marker. There was a house in Holley that has a marker in front of it now for Chauncey Robinson. Chauncey Robinson, boy, I can't even say my own last name, was originally from Clarendon, and he was pro-abolition, very vocal, like Robert Anderson was in Gaines, and he moved from Clarendon to Holley, and the sign on the outside marks the location of the Brainerd House, which was built by Ezra Brainerd, inventor of Brainerd Truss Bridge. He was a contractor on the Erie Canal who built the Sandy Creek embankment in Holley. The grandson details visiting his grandfather, who took him up to the second floor of the back side of the house. The grandfather pulled back a curtain and there was a group of escaped slaves on beds. More research showed that Robinson was in fact an outspoken abolitionist. This is the second historical marker in Orleans County about African American history. Medina in April 2015 unveiled a marker on Main Street in recognition of 2 speeches delivered in the community by Frederick Douglass, leading abolitionist. The Holley marker highlights a local resident advocating for escaped slaves. The 2-sided marker highlights Robinson and the Underground Railroad. Now that was put up, this article was 2020, so it's only recently that that marker was put up. And Lemuel Pratt, who was mentioned in several of the articles, was a man who lived in Clarendon and was very anti-slavery. He pushed for abolition. And he was the man who set up the meetings for Frederick Douglass to come to Orleans County. So it was more than one place in the county that was pushing for abolition. Let's see here. Okay, the Underground Railroad New York corridor. What is included in Orleans County is the Brainerd House in Holley, where Chauncey Robinson sheltered escaped slaves. Joel Whiting, the Albion Academy, sheltered escaped slaves. And Isaac Bennett, who built the Barrett House now in Medina, was also a station on the Underground Railroad. And also the Brick House in Barre, from verbal recognition, was a spot on the Underground Railroad. Those spots can be verified. There were other places that have been remarked on about being on the Underground Railroad, although they haven't been proven yet. There were anti-slavery meetings in Niagara and Orleans County. Frederick Douglass and William Watkins contemplate holding a series of anti-slavery meetings in the above counties Wednesday, August 15th. The following places have already been named by Mr. Lemuel Pratt of North Ridgeway. The friends in each of these places are called upon to make immediate arrangements for the meetings, and they are at liberty to fix the hour for their lectures. We hope nothing will be wanting on their part towards rendering them successful in every respect. So the notice went out to have set up a meeting because the anti-slavery group was wanting to talk to you. Lemuel Pratt was a documented abolitionist in Somerset and Orleans County. The National Era October 23rd, 1856 obituary says, died in Somerset, Niagara County, New York, of typhoid fever, September 16, 1856. Deacon Lemuel Pratt, age 65 years. The subject of this notice embraced religion in his youth, and up to his death lived a practiced Christian. He was a pioneer in the cause of temperance as well as anti-slavery. So even in his obituary, Lemuel Pratt was listed as an abolitionist. I read this the other day and thought, well, yeah, this would go too. The Underground Railroad began operating in earnest in the 1830s in Rochester and vicinity. So from the 1830s to the late 1850s, Underground Railroad was operating from Rochester to Buffalo area through Orleans County. Both black and white people managed the railroad as well as people of different denominations. So it wasn't just one denomination or all just Italians or all just Polish or, It was everybody working together. The Quakers, Isaac and Amy Post, probably helped the greatest number of runaway slaves, followed by Presbyterians, Samuel Porter and his sister Maria. Certain members of the founding Fitzhugh family were involved in helping the cause financially and politically. Elizabeth Potts Fitzhugh married James Birney, who became the Liberty Party candidate for president in 1840 and 44. Her sister, Anne Carroll Fitzhugh, was the wife of the famed abolitionist Congressman Gerrit Smith. A third sister, Mary Fitzhugh, was married to John Tallman, a banker who owned the Tallman building in which Frederick Douglass was to begin his North Star. Tallman also gave abolitionist speeches. So you can see that families supported the idea, not just one person in that family. But maybe Uncle Charlie did, but the rest of us do too, in our own way. When Frederick Douglass moved to Rochester in 1847 to begin his abolitionist paper, he became one of the prime stationmasters on the railroad. Both his home and office were used as stations. The African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church was a stop. William Bloss' home, located where today's Cutler building is also said to have been a stop. Several other local places were probably stops, but here the picture gets murky, as documentation proving a location's use as a stop is hard to find. There are disagreements among scholars and researchers, and the list of stops vary greatly. So you have to, when you're listing stops on the Underground Railroad, like I said before, you have to distinguish between local gossip and any proof you might have. And the proof is the harder thing to come by. Now, where did I put it? There were stops on the Underground Railroad in Orleans County by quite a few. And the people who were involved were, like I said, Chauncey Robinson in Holley, Professor Whiting in Albion, and Lemuel Pratt in North Ridgeway. Robert Anderson, also on the Ridge, was listed as an abolitionist. And on one of the charts that lists the important abolitionists in each county in New York State, the only one listed for Orleans County is Robert Anderson. And yet we can find proof for at least 3 others that operated on the Underground Railroad. And there was a man named George Ruggles, who was born and raised here in Orleans County. He eventually moved to Rochester, but he ran a boat called the H.M. Ballou. And the stories in Rochester is that he took, quote, cargo across Lake Ontario to Canada. So Mr. Ballou, who was born and raised here but moved to Rochester, was also considered an operator on the Freedom Train. Myron Holley, also from our area, founded the Anti-Slavery Liberty Party. Underground Railroad agents were Robert Anderson and Joel Whiting, also Isaac Bennett in Medina. So you can see there were a lot of connections with Orleans County and the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad has a lot of terminology too. If you get to digging into it, you'll find there were stations. They were places where they could stop. Stationmasters, the person who ran the station that you could contact if you had slaves coming through. The trains were the connections for the person who would take the slaves from one place to another. So there's a lot of railroad terminology that is found connected with the Underground Railroad, so you can understand what they're saying about transporting the slaves. And there were a lot of men and women in Orleans County that were anti-slavery to a great extent. Originally, early years, not so much. You can't find a lot of people. But after the 1840s, late 1840s, through the 1850s, when Frederick Douglass was around and visited this county a number of times, giving speeches in every town, all of a sudden abolition became a major source. But I think they heard it from the mouth of someone who truly believed in abolition and that did not believe in slavery. Because Orleans County before that was kind of, it isn't really, we don't have slaves here. So we don't really care too much. Once Frederick Douglass came here and stayed here like 3 weeks in 1840s, he was here in Orleans County going around and lecturing in all kinds of spots, in churches and some people's houses. He was lecturing about abolition. For 3 weeks, Frederick Douglass was in Orleans County. So you can see where the turning point was. When they had connection with him and heard it from his mouth, then Orleans County began to take it a little more seriously. And we had more stops on the Underground Railroad. I know I've thrown quite a bit at you today. Does anybody have any questions? Any comments? Yeah.
So was this information never written down?
It hasn't been compiled like in one brochure or one book about the Underground Railroad in Orleans County.
So let's say you said it's 1830 to 1850?
Yeah, late 1830s through 1855 or so.
So did anyone keep a record during that time, or that was taboo because someone would find out?
People did, but some of it is just now coming out. Like I said, you hear stories, but nobody wrote it down, and that's where it's hard to piece it together. You hear one story, but then you have to track it down to see if there's any legitimate cause to even start to believe it. And then you have to check the census records and see where they lived and who they had, So it's a lot of piecing little pieces together.
Was there a law book or any kind of, like anything to check off or,
Yeah, not that I know of. Bill, do you? No.
No, these abolitionists were harboring fugitives.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to get in trouble. So they didn't write anything down that could be absconded by the authorities.
Yeah.
So my ancestor, Robert Anderson, ran for lieutenant governor on the Liberty Party ticket in 1848. The Liberty Party was a one-issue party, abolition. He got 1,000-some votes in New York State. Mm-hmm. Obviously, one-party issue wasn't going to go anywhere.
Right.
But stories handed down to my family, his son, Nahum Anderson, was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. They didn't have any secret hiding place in the house. They simply kept him in the basement where there was a kitchen.
Yeah, there wasn't necessarily a structured place.
No.
It was where they could safely store them without being found out and then sneak them out again.
So then after the Civil War, was it even safe to write that stuff down then?
I don't think people would ever write it down. Because there might have been repercussions after the Civil War.
Right.
So how do you know when the cutoff part is where nobody will turn you in or accuse you? Or
so it could have been decades later.
A lot of times it is. A lot of times it is decades later. Yeah. The Clarendon historian happened across a letter written by a nephew about the house in Holley. And this is in the 2000s is when this letter was found. So unless a relative has held on to it and says, okay, I can prove that my uncle was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Unless somebody verbally comes out and says that and has the proof in their hand, there's nothing I can tell you that's proof. Until these people are proven, I can tell you I think they were. I can tell you they were at this place at the right time.
So it's
But to have hard proof, to take it to court, no, I can't. Anybody else? Yeah.
The place in Medina, where is that, or what was that?
Oh man, I can't think what street it's on. It's there. It has a plaque in front of it.
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a bad place.
I'm not familiar enough with the streets in Medina to be able to tell you, but I have a feeling it's down towards the canal.
We've got a place that's only a little bit from.
Yeah.
That's not the plaque that's down, I'll call it West Main Street, right? Just a little bit close to where the, is that Main Street Furniture or something?
That's the Frederick Douglass plaque.
The Frederick
Douglass one that says that he spoke there.
Okay.
Yeah, because this house was just recently verified.
Oh,
But
okay.
but I want to say it's near the canal. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar enough with the streets and I didn't write it down. But there is a plaque there now for a house on the Underground Railroad. Yeah.
I always heard that the house at the corner of 31A and 98 was a stop because there were hidden rooms in there. And then I also heard, I don't know whether it's at all verifiable or whether what people wanted you to think was that red brick Victorian that's in between 98 and 31A and Albion. It's like across from the chiropractic.
Oh, I know what you mean. Yeah.
House.
Steve Gallon's
house.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard that was a stop also.
I've never heard that.
Maybe
But that
they
doesn't
just wanted it to be.
maybe to get a historic plaque for that.
And then, but I think the one at the top of the hill, I think that was what people said, that was Wolcott's when we were little.
Uh-huh.
And I think they thought that had been the stop also.
That was a tavern.
What?
That was a tavern.
The tavern.
Was it tavern?
Northeast corner, that was a tavern.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's
That's an
green
old,
now.
old place, that could
Yeah,
be.
it's like a green, it's green now. It used to be brown.
Wolcott's used to live there.
Yeah, years ago.
Yeah, and I think the thing of it is for Underground Railroad, we can look at the houses today and say, oh, I betcha.
Well, yeah, I mean.
Because I can do that with mine.
Right. Yeah.
My house has a stairway to the cellar out of my kitchen. Above that is a trap door. And just after we moved there, my husband and son pushed up that trap door to see what was up there, why that trap door was there.
Yeah.
That upstairs is papered with wallpaper. Okay, can we make an assumption?
It's only accessible by the trap door?
Yeah,
What was it?
I don't know.
What is it?
I don't know, but you can get up to the attic, which is, I guess we call it a crawl space today.
Yeah.
It's not a stand up in the attic,
Yeah.
but it's papered. Why would you wallpaper your attic crawl space? I mean, so I could say, oh, well, they
Well,
had slaves up there.
The house I grew up in had a lot of spots that people
Yeah.
could have gone to.
Well, in our
And
house,
stored.
they had horse stalls in the basement. And that's what they used to use. But the end of my house was part of the barn, where they stored the horses and the tackle. But now it isn't. It's part of my basement, where I keep canned goods and that sort of thing. But there are square spots where they look like horse stalls, and I'm sure probably that's what they were.
Yeah.
But that's where today you live in a house and you can speculate on what that crawl space was or what that. But we gotta have proof.
It's like too big. It's not really a linen closet. It's kind of. I mean, we had a closet that had a closet up above in the house that I grew up in, up on South Main Street,
Mm-hmm.
and you wouldn't know it was there
Yeah.
unless you went into this closet, this little
Right.
bedroom.
And we look at it now as, what would you want that little bitty room for? But they did dry herbs. They did house food. We're looking at, we got the refrigerator, we got the freezer, we can go downtown buy some. But when some of these houses were built, those things were non-existent. So you had small spaces up above where you dried herbs, you know, or dried veggies, that sort of thing. Where today we can't comprehend having to have that little space up there. What was that for? You know, so a lot of these spaces are labeled as Underground Railroad spaces, when they were just normal, everyday, it's my house, I need that space. So until we can prove it in writing, in somebody's reminiscence or something, even records in the county clerk's office of who bought it from who, and I mean, there's sometimes you fall over something if you trace a deed back, and you find out something that was listed in deed. I did research on deeds when I was historian for the town of Gaines, and it's amazing the kind of things you can find in those deeds.
I've got 6 secret rooms in my house, and I deed this to the next guy.
There you go. But you can. I mean, these clues are all over, but you have to have a lifetime and a half to track them all down.
Well, I even had someone who said to me recently that they live near the near Densmore, I think it was, and you know, some of the old quarries, you know, there's kind of caves built within the quarries, and they said that could have, they heard that was also used, but
yeah.
again, I heard this, I heard that.
Right, yeah, but until you can document, you can tell the stories. I mean, yeah, they sound pretty good. It'd be a lot of good stories.
Good. I would like to be on the Underground Railroad.
But until you can verify it, don't say, I know that was a place on the Underground Railroad. You know, it sounds like the stories I've heard is pretty much, yeah, I think maybe it was, but I can't prove it. You know, and that's, it's hard to prove because at the time it was supposed to be unprovable. They didn't want anybody to know.
Well, they could go to jail.
Well, of course, yeah.
And
For
the
harboring
people had
slaves.
gone all the way up here to have them get taken back.
Right.
All that way.
Yep. So mum was the word. We didn't
Yeah.
talk about it. You know, maybe your closest family might have known, but they were sworn to secrecy. Because if they jabbered, then you go to jail.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
And it's hard to imagine when, you know, we're talking about rooms, but the size of this table would be enough room
Absolutely.
for 5 people.
Yep. Absolutely.
And all you're doing is just sitting there,
Yep.
and you've got a door and.
Well, it's like the one story of the girl here that her father was the conductor on the Underground Railroad, and they had the school here between academies. And she would say, now this was a old schoolhouse. This wasn't any big deal. This was
It's not the one that's there now.
No. It was like a third of that size.
Okay.
I mean, it was a small brick building with a peaked roof. Well, you went upstairs where they taught school, and then you go up to the attic. We're getting pretty small up in there. And she followed her father up with a plate of food in his hand and saw several black faces. So they didn't say just one. We had a slave, there were several. So like he said, they were packed in there, waiting for darkness so they could take off and walk to the next safe place. So, yes, it was something that's very hard to document. Until somebody falls up, like the historian for Clarendon. She got a letter, found a letter that was a family letter of a grandson or nephew writing about that house and the relative being a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And that's as close a documentation you're going to get.
And I think the thing that just came to me is we've got to remember that back in those days, the number of people that could write was less than the number of people that are sitting in this.
Absolutely.
So am I going to keep a record of something? I don't think so, because I don't know.
I don't know how.
I don't know how to write.
Yeah. And if you did find a book that had numbers in it, like an accounting book, you wouldn't necessarily know that it had anything to do with that.
No.
That was just an account book found in the house, which it could mean they were keeping statistics, but how do we prove it now? You can't prove it now. You know? So how many of those ledgers have gotten tossed out because we didn't know what they were? makes you stay up at night trying to figure out.
Or, you know, you think about how many, you take over a house and how many people came in.
Oh, yeah.
And they closed, I mean, they filled up in that wooden doorway with bricks and, you know, so you can't get there from here, so you don't even know that
Right.
you come in.
Well, and
50 years
years
later.
ago, they had different reasons for different rooms.
Yes.
My house, which is on the ridge up by Cobblestone, has 2 front doors. One that goes into the stairway and a funeral door, which is wider because the funerals were held in the house, not at a funeral home. And you had to have a doorway wide enough to take that casket out. So my house has a funeral door. But will people who live in my house later on realize that's what that other door is for?
Only if you keep a record
You
of
know,
it.
only if I write it down. No, but that's true. There are places in houses that got bricked up or got, you know, that's like, I would like to know why they wallpapered the attic. I mean, it's just a crawl space. Why would you bother taking wallpaper up there? And I don't understand. I'm not saying it was anything untoward or hidden, but why would you take time to wallpaper an attic? Crawl space. I mean, I don't know. Yes.
Other than Mr. Latin being an ancestor, do we know of any other ancestors to these people?
I personally don't, but I think probably there are to these because they were local people. And I know myself there are people here that are 5, 6 generations down, you know, that their uncle or their great aunt or whatever. I know in my hometown, my heritage goes back to my grandparents and then stops because 2 of my grandparents came directly from Germany at the turn of the century. One of my grandparents came from Poland at the turn of the century. The only line I have that goes back is my mother's line, which was Hopkins. It goes clear back to when God was born. You know, I mean, that you have to go through all Hopkins's.
I think of Mr. Pratt, and I believe my dad told me about a teacher that he had up in Gaines.
Yes.
Was that Mr. Pratt?
Yes,
Would
yes.
that have been his son? Or?
Howard Pratt.
Howard, yeah.
But that's like Robinson's. You know, is this Robinson related to that Robinson? Is this Smith related to that? I wouldn't be surprised because Pratt is a name that's common around here in its history and local. But there again, you have to take and trace them back, you know, to find out.
I thought Howard was the historian.
Howard was the historian in the town of Gaines before I was.
Yes.
I learned a lot of what I know from Howard. Yeah.
My mother used to talk about him all the time.
Oh yeah, he knew it was, well, he grew up here. His ancestors were here. It would be like my going back to my hometown, and I know some things that maybe an appointed historian would know either. But that's just because I grew up there, you know, and I know what my grandma said, and I know what my grandpa said, and, you know, so it'd be like that with Howard. He lived here, his family lived here. And so he had all the family stories plus what he researched. Yeah.
And I think the other thing that we forget is, there might have been 4 sections of a family living here, but then 3 of them got off. One moved to Illinois, one went to Ohio, one went to Mississippi.
Absolutely.
And so there goes all that history that you have no idea about.
Right. Yep. So if you know facts, write them down. Give them to your local historian. And that's something special about New York State. We have a historian for every village, city, town, county. So there would be someone who would keep records that you can give to. And I know I was historian for the town of Gaines for quite a few years. And it's really exciting when you find out somebody has given you records that go back to the late 1800s or whatever.
Yeah, but you have to have that mindset of being excited to learn about stuff.
Yeah.
Because how many
That's true.
You tell somebody, oh, this, big deal.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and it's like, I guess I was probably started on that when I was a little girl.
Yeah.
Because when my grandparents died, my mother's mother, who was married to a man from Poland who came over here when he was a teenager, he rode a motorcycle to date my grandmother, okay, because he couldn't afford a car. So, and she lived south of town where the hills went up and down. So he would ride his motorcycle up to her house and then get her on the motorcycle and then they'd drift down so he wouldn't use up all the gas. And I've got a picture of my grandparents with my grandmother straddling the motorcycle and my grandfather in the car on the side.
Makes sense.
Which, I think that's great. And my other grandmother, my dad's mother, came over here from Germany when she was 4. And I have the jacket that she wore on the ship when she came over here. It looks like a German military jacket. And she was only 4 years old. So that kind of thing has gotten my interest pumped up. And you can see why I'm curious and I want to know more. Because I've got that much background that I think it's fun to document things and prove.
Are you the village historian?
No, I was the town of Gaines
I know
historian.
you're the town of Gaines.
But I am now just the historian for Hogue Library.
Oh, okay.
I run the history room. Yeah. Anybody
You've
else?
got stuff.
Yeah, I got lots of stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
You probably have enough stuff.
I think something that's kind of interesting that's happening is they're trying to create a Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad New York corridor, and they're looking at running it right along the ridge.
Yeah.
And then also at the New York State Parks and Recreation and Historic Preservation, they have, there's a whole page on their site that talks about the Underground Railroad in New York State.
Yeah. Yeah, and Hogue Library now, as far as I'm concerned, now this is my opinion, not anybody else's, but Hogue Library is the museum for Albion,
Yes. Okay.
for the village and the town.
You're right.
Because we have an archive where we keep one-of-a-kind items that have been donated. And we have the local history room where people can come in and do research on their families or the development of this area. And I think there should be a museum to keep all the things in, but right now we are the museum for Orleans County, for this area, Central Orleans County. Yes, ma'am.
It's a book about Frederick Douglass, written by Rochester. It's all Rochester. He's buried in Hogue. And there's a gazillion lot of information. The farthest west they go in here is Hilton. So which was, I bought this at a bookstore in Brockport many years ago. I just finished reading it, but it was very interesting. He was a very charismatic speaker.
Yes.
And a very good-looking young man. So he was very popular going around visiting.
Yes.
And
Well, like I said, that he was here for 3 weeks,
and
talking to everybody.
I live in the town of Barre, and I had heard that story about that house from the time I was little.
Oh, I'm sure.
In school. And many years ago now, and I don't know, Helen Evans is town historian.
Yeah, I knew Helen.
And the county historians went to that brick house and saw the room that supposedly was the underground room. Now, again, I have no idea if it's been documented, but I'm going to find out.
Okay, you do that. You let me know what you find out.
I heard that property was taken off of mine originally.
Oh,
So
okay.
I can find out when that happened.
Yeah.
Because my abstract is this.
Well, now, so you're my researcher. I want to know what you find out. Anybody else? Well, thank you for listening.
I have to do an announcement. Hang on, friends. If you haven't had enough D yet, at the end of September, on September 25th at 7 o'clock, she's going to be doing a special presentation at 7 o'clock at the Gaines Schoolhouse on Gaines Basin Road, and it's going to be about FDR. He actually was here in Albion a couple of times, and it's called FDR Slept Here. And that's, we're sponsoring that by the Orleans County Historical Association. And then at the end of October, on the 30th, Jim Friday is going to be coming in and doing this talk on Medina sandstone. So it's a free program, we'd love to have you. And anything else you want to add to that, Dee?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.